So what I'm going to, I made a couple changes in this, and just to start out with, this is, for those of you who have been here all week, this is picking up on something we started on yesterday, okay? So I want to just share a context for what we're going to be talking about today for those of you who are here for the first time. There's a book that goes back, I'm trying to remember where it came out, but there's a book called The Making of a Mediator. Anybody familiar with that book? Okay, it's by Taylor and Lang and Taylor. And it really looks at the development of a mediator. You know, what are the developmental stages of mediation, which we talked about yesterday. And then they introduce what they call their constellation of theories. And their constellation of theories is a framework that allows the mediator to reflect on what informs my practice. What's the constellation of life experience, professional development, professional orientation, beliefs, values that are informing me as a mediator. And again, this is also built on, I shared a model yesterday. Anybody familiar with the book Bringing Peace into the Room by Bowling and Hoffman? So Bowling and Hoffman wrote a book called Bringing Peace into the Room. And the basic premise of the book, Bringing Peace in the Room, was to challenge the mythology of mediation, and I use that term not disrespectfully, that mediators are neutral and impartial. What they would say is, all mediators know that they're not neutral and impartial, meaning that, not that we don't function neutrally or impartially, but we are not neutral or impartial. We have values, we have beliefs, we have experience, we have worldviews that are informing us. And so therefore, as mediators, we need to, I'm going to use the term, be mindful of what is informing us in our practice as we commit to engaging as neutrals in that effective way. So, just give you the framework. They say there are central core beliefs and values, and these are beliefs and values about things like truth, okay, and justice, all right, that inform us. I mean, those things that I shared that I used to have all-nighters in college with friends talking about, you know, is there truth? I mean, those kinds of things. But we have beliefs and values about those that inform who we are and how we show up. We have theories and abstracts is the term that we use. And that, I think one of the interesting things about dispute resolution as a profession is that there are multiple theories and abstracts from related professional contexts that inform our practice. You know, as dispute resolution has grown, and depending on the context in which you're doing dispute resolution or conflict engagement, your practice is informed by theories. You know, if you're doing family mediation kind of work, that's informed by certain things. If we're doing a special education, if we're doing, victim offender, if we're doing organizational work, and a lot of the work that I do is with organizations, and so there's this whole OD context of ideas that are influencing that work. The third element of the constellation is models and approaches. And we talked about that as mediators, we have been trained in different models of mediation, and I identified some of those. If you're sort of my orientation, the first mediation training I took, the model was, it was an interest-based model, based on getting to yes, that really gave a basic structure for how you analyze and understand the conflict. And the mediation process that we follow in that model, the 8-stage model, if you do it in 8-stage or something like that model, is really built on that particular theory, okay? And then we had transformative mediation that came out with, Bush and Folger, the promise of mediation. They introduced a different model. And then we have narrative mediation, Winslade and Monk. I mean, they talk about that. And each of those is in a different sort of style, model of dealing with mediation. We've differentiated between evaluative and facilitative, those kinds of things, okay? And the final element of the model are facts and information. We bring in, and this was a debate from years ago, is how much knowledge do you as a mediator need to have about the dispute? I actually remember the first class I ever took in dispute resolution, and probably in the late 80s, was someone told me, you don't need to know anything about the dispute. I mean, that was sort of the belief at that time. You are just the mediator. And of course, many of us know that's been challenged. If you're going to mediate or facilitate an IEP and go, excuse me, what is an IEP? Your confidence and competence is sort of going to come into question, okay? So we've spent time, and this morning really was around more of the facts and information. You know, what's happening in the substantive context of special education that will inform our practice? What are the changes in rules and regulations? What are key court cases that give us information about this actually pretty complex landscape that we find ourselves entering into, okay? So that's the basic that's the basic structure that we're looking at. And what Lang and Taylor really have tried to do with this model is say, can I have some organizational mechanism that allows me to become a reflective practitioner and reflect on what's informing my practice? What informs my practice at sort of a macro level, and even what informs my practice at a micro level, at a very specific intervention level? What's informing that particular practice, okay? So that's what's driving this. A second piece I would put out there, and I think this is probably not new for many of you, but recognizing that, I remember the first mediation training I went through, they introduced us to what's called the triangle of satisfaction, and you've all probably seen the triangle of satisfaction. And if you haven't, the triangle of satisfaction says that when people participate in a decision-making process, they will assess their satisfaction with that event or that process or that experience, basically looking at three elements. The first level of satisfaction is substantive. Did we get an outcome? Did we address the issue? You know, did we reach an agreement? So was there a substantive outcome to what we set out to do? And I'm not satisfied, or satisfied, I walk away going, well, we didn't achieve anything, okay? The second level of satisfaction is what? Procedural satisfaction. What's the process by which we reached a substantive outcome? Was the process fair? Was it just? Okay, was it balanced? Or was someone railroaded or cajoled or whatever term we want to use to reach some sort of a settlement, okay? So maybe we reached an outcome, but I'm going, yeah, the process really kind of stunk. It wasn't fair, nobody listened to me. So, and then the third level of satisfaction is what? Relational satisfaction. So you hear psychological satisfaction, emotional, relational satisfaction. But I often look at what's the quality of the relationship after this time working together. I joke and say, do I walk away from this meeting going, I hope I never see that person again, okay? Or do I walk away from the meeting going, you know, I have a deeper understanding of where that person is coming from, okay? I've had both experiences. I've been on teams that have met where actually when the team disbanded, I felt a certain level of grieving that, shoot, I don't get to meet with these people anymore, okay? Now, again, why do I share this? This is a review for many people, but it's just a sense of realizing that what are we trying to balance and achieve in this process called mediation? We're trying to help people achieve satisfaction around some challenge, and that satisfaction is going to be assessed in a number of different ways, okay? So that's out there. The last, I think, piece that I want to reflect on before I dive into this is probably more of a personal way of what I'm thinking about, how I think about mediation and facilitation. You know, I think my primary function as a mediator or facilitator is to step into someone else's conversation, in many cases restructure it to produce a different outcome. So I am always thinking about mediation or facilitation in the context of a conversation. You know, you're inviting me into your conversation, and you're inviting me into your conversation as a facilitator, sometimes proactively, so that the conversation will be successful. Or you're inviting me into your conversation that's really reached impasse and stuck, and you're needing someone to help break that impasse and move forward. And fundamentally, you're going to ask me to change that conversation. I shared with the group that's been here all week that I was asked to facilitate a school meeting once, and the principal, who's a friend of mine, I said, why do you need a facilitator? He said, we've been Maytagging for 2 years. I said, Maytagging, what does that mean? He said, we're stuck in the spin cycle and we can't get out, you know? And this idea is that we're having the same conversation and we need someone to come in and move the conversation in a different direction. So another just sort of model that I'm going to share for me is the question I'm always asking when I step into a mediation or facilitation is, what's the conversation we need to be having? I'm always reflecting, what's the question we need to be having? And I'm often looking at what's the conversation they're having, and what conversation they need to be having, and how am I going to help them move in that conversation? So given that, over the years, I've just developed a number of different models, sort of theories, structures, paradigms, whatever you want to use, that help me as a mediator and or facilitator assess where the conversation needs to go. So I'm going to share those 4 models with you. They come from a number of different contexts. 3 of them probably come more out of a dispute resolution or therapy context. 4th comes really more out of a leadership context. But I would say that these are deeply in my sort of repertoire of practice skills when I go in that I want us to share. So the way I'm going to be doing this is I'm going to share a model with you. I'll just share, here's a construct, here's an idea and a model. And then I'm going to invite you, your table groups, to say, where might you see an application of this model in the role that you use as a mediator? Now, everything we're going to talk about, every model we're going to talk about, is applicable in a much broader context than just special ed mediation, okay? So for those of you who have practiced in multiple areas, either as a mediator and or facilitator, everything we're going to talk about has application in a much broader context, okay? So I'm going to want you to be thinking about application both in the context of the work that we're here to do around special ed mediation, but I also want you to reflect on the work where it might add value in other areas in which you find yourself doing work. Does that make sense? Okay. This is just so I want to give you a new way of seeing. I live in the Pacific Northwest, and in the community in which I live, there's a big old park. And the big old park used to be a military base, and now it's owned by the park department. And there's an old building there that a local community group took over, and they built an observatory. We have a sort of a local astronomical society, and so they took the building over, and they built a classroom, and they put a dome on top, installed a pretty cool telescope. And so the club runs this thing, and so they had an open house one Sunday, and my son and I went over to say, we're kind of interested in that, it's kind of cool. We're both kind of in that thing, and so we went over to the park to see what was going on. It was a beautiful sunny August day, middle of the day, and I think, okay, what's there to look at? I mean, I sort of assume you use telescopes at night to look at dark stuff, and things like that. Well, they had the big telescope on top, and then the club members had their individual telescopes out on the lawn, and they were all looking at the sun. Now, if you think about the eclipse recently, we were told not to do that, so I was thinking, this is like really stupid. However, every one of them had a filter on it so that it made it safe to look at the sun, okay? So I walked up to the first telescope, and I looked at the sun, and what did you see? But you see this sort of a white orb, but you could actually see the sunspots on it. Well, that's kind of cool. So then I walked to the next telescope, looking at exactly the same thing, but it had a very different, a really high-tech gas filter on it. And when you looked at the sun, you saw a black sphere, but you could see all the corona activity around the outside. It was really cool. Now, it just became sort of this metaphor for me that we're looking at the same thing through a different set of lenses, frameworks, and being informed differentially by that set of parameters that we're looking at. So that's what I see we're offering here. I want to add to your toolbox, your repertoire, some different ways of looking at difficult conversations, i.e. conflicts, mediations, and facilitations, so as to be informed and therefore help inform the parties, okay? One of the, Christopher Moore, one of his books way back in mediation, decides the function of a mediator is to intervene. So these are some strategies to facilitate and inform where and how you're going to intervene in the conflict by helping bring some order and structure out of the particular conflict. Now, the first model is not really a dispute resolution model, but I use this a lot with groups and teams. And this model comes from a book called Leadership Without Easy Answers by Ronald Heifetz. I don't know if you're familiar with it. Heifetz teaches, it's not a dispute resolution book, he teaches leadership at the Kennedy School of Government. This is not in your handout. So this is the model you won't get, I'm sorry. If you want the slides, I'll send them to you, okay? But I just thought, oh, I'll throw this in. But Heifetz, the question Heifetz asks is, what's the nature of the work that the people are taking on? So when I'm working with a team, I'm thinking about what's the nature of the work that you're taking on. If I'm facilitating, facilitating, it's like, what's the nature of the work? And so that's the fundamental question that he asks, all right? And in Heifetz's model, he differentiates between two types of work, technical work and adaptive work. Technical work is where we're solving a technical problem. And a technical problem is a problem for which a solution already exists. Okay, it's like we don't have to create this, we don't have to find the solution, it's out there. And the solution often exists in best practice, it exists in policy and procedure. And so what the group has to do is, one, figure out what's the challenge we're taking on, and where's the answer? Where's the solution? How do we access it? And then how do we implement it? Okay? So that's technical work. Technical work, again, underpinning kind of phenomenal. It does not require a lot of new learning. It requires accessing existing learning and knowledge. The second type of work that he identifies is adaptive work. Adaptive work is where two things are going on. One, we as a group cannot agree on the nature of the problem. We cannot jointly define it. We don't know what it is. We know that something isn't the way it should be, but we don't know why. If I was to go around and ask you to weigh in on what the problem is we're here to solve, we'd get different perspectives. Kind of like doing an opening statement in mediation, right? Everyone's they're weighing in on a different point of it, okay? The second part of adaptive work is that if we could get our sort of hands and our head and brain around the problem, the challenge is there is no solution. Or there is no, quote, off-the-shelf solution. What's going to be required to do adaptive work, and this is a fundamental piece of sort of Heifetz's model, is new learning is required to deal with the challenge. Now, new learning now is going to be operating at two levels. New learning about how collectively are we going to understand what the problem is, and two, new learning about how are we going to engage or challenge or deal with that particular challenge. Now I'm just curious, does that remind you of anything that we've been talking about? Anybody willing to say? Special education. You know, special education, I've been a special educator for 37 years. And there are two dimensions to special education. There's a technical dimension to special education. There's rules and regulations and policies and procedures. There's this thing called an IEP that's defined. We don't go, we need to have an IEP meeting. Do you have any idea what that is? No, it's written down. We know what an IEP is, okay? The other most important part of special education is special education fundamentally, by definition, is adaptive work. Because we talk about FAPE, but what differentiates special education from a 504 plan? Specially Designed Instruction, SDI. SDI is adaptive work. Special education says we've tried this, we've tried tier 1, we've tried tier 2, we're into tier 3 where we need to create something new and unique, okay? Now here's my bias, I'll get on my soapbox just for a moment and then I'll get off. One of my concerns, and this is a concern that really comes from the work we're doing in Washington, but I think we put a lot of energy into the technical side of special education. I'm not so sure we've lost some of the ability to really engage in the truly adaptive, innovative, creative, adaptive side of special education. And I think as those of us who are mediating and facilitating in this context, I think it's incumbent on us to come in that we are facilitating a conversation that has technical dimensions to it, but my own bias is it is fundamentally an adaptive process. Now, where this hit me, and I don't mean to be offensive here, because I need to know, I was a special ed administrator, so I get this, but I was in California working with the group, and a group of us were having dinner, and one of the teachers was lamenting at dinner. He said, you know what my biggest frustration is? I said, what? He says, I'm being told that the characteristics of a good IEP is that it be legally defensible. And I'm going, I get that, but you know, I don't think that those who identified and designed the IEP process said, we want to bring together a group of people who will draft a legally defensible document. Now, I think what they had in mind is we'll bring a group of people together who will do some adaptive work, who will then document those agreements in a legally defensible way. And so I think it's just important to balance that at the table, we're really trying to look at those two dimensions. And if you really want me going on a tangent, I can go on a tangent, but I won't go on a tangent. Does that make sense? The distinction between technical and adaptive, and seeing really that it is a key to the work that we do. We are facilitating and mediating conversations that are both, okay? Now, Heifetz also talks about the role of leadership, which is going to drive this third slide, but I just want to show, out of Heifetz's model, that's kind of funky, he identifies 3 types of situations in which we find ourselves. And I like to say these are actually 3 different types of conversations. Now, why do I say that? Because it works for me. The question I'm always asking is, what kind of conversation do we need to be having? And are we having the right conversation? So I'm going to just share these 3 types of situations in which we find ourselves. I'm going to ask you to reflect on these at your tables. The first is a type 1 situation where, 1, the problem we're trying to solve is clear-cut. If I'm working with you as a team, and I asked you to define the problem and go around the table, you'd be all on the same page. Say, this is what it is, okay? And if I was to ask you, so how do you think we address that problem, you would all have the same solution. Because more often than not, that solution is embedded in a policy and procedure. So for example, we agree that we need to get parents' permission to get a child assessed. Oh my gosh, I wonder how you do that. We know how to do that. We have forms for doing that, right? And so typically we would say, okay, who's going to do that? And so we would, at least when I was in the business, school psychologist, that's your job, do that process, case manager, whoever. End of conversation. Real simple. No technical solution. Not a lot of options A, B, or C, or D. It's like, well, we do this, okay? A type 2 situation is slightly different. A type 2 situation is where the problem we're trying to solve, we all agree what the problem is. However, in this case, there are multiple solutions. There are a range of options, all which are valid, research-based methodologies, whatever you want to say. And so typically what we'll do in that situation is, while there's not learning required here, there is learning required here. And the learning is, we need to figure out what our options are. And typically what we will do is we will find someone who has technical expertise and say, teach us about what those options are. So for example, if we were to say, we really need some more information about this child's expressive language capacity and potential, who might we go to who has expertise in that particular area? Speech and language pathologist, potentially. If we're trying to figure out whether this child has some mobility issues, depending on how it's manifesting itself, we're going to go where? To a physical therapist or an occupational therapist. And say, this is your area of expertise, get some information and come back and inform us as a team as to what some options are, so that then we as a team can make a decision, okay? So you're giving authority to expertise to take that on. In some cases, we agree to bring in outside expertise to come in and say, inform us, what our options are. In a context where we don't have the expertise at the team, we're going to bring in expertise, okay? So that's a combination of technical work in that you're engaging technical expertise to facilitate your learning, your adaptive work, so that you can then solve the particular problem, okay? Third type of situation is the more complex. It's like, 1, we don't agree on what the problem is. We don't know what the problem is. We're not in agreement, which is often a mediator gets called in or a facilitator gets called in because we're not even sure what we should be talking about, okay? Here's a classic example of a type 3 situation for me, at least in the work that I do. I get a call from a district superintendent or maybe a high school principal and say, I need you to come work with my staff. Okay, great. What's the problem? I don't know, it's a climate culture issue. Okay. That's really clear, isn't it? I've got some assumptions, but I have to be very careful. I don't know what he or she means by that, climate or culture. So we're going to have to get some information to find out, is it a community issue? Is it a student issue? Is it an administrative issue? Is it a staff issue? Is it all of the above, some of the above? So you got to go out and gather some data to figure out and get some information and say, can we begin to define, get our heads around what this particular issue is? And then the second piece is that once we've kind of got an idea of what we're dealing with and what we need to do, there is no solution. There's no off-the-shelf solution. We as a group are going to have to come up with some sort of intervention, which is why we have a team of people with diverse perspectives to share that diversity of perspectives, to facilitate our shared learning, so we can come together and craft some solution to go forward and try it. Is there any guarantee that what we're going to try is going to work? Nope. It's our best informed course of action, given what we've learned and what we know, to try to move forward. Dealing with behavior with kids in schools, great examples, okay, of that, okay? Questions on the differences between type 1, type 2, or type 3 situations. Okay, in your table groups, what I would like you to do is to come up with examples from mediations you've done, starting out in special education and moving beyond that if you'd like to. In a labor case, potentially. You do that work, right? Okay. Community-based mediation, okay, family. Examples of type 1, type 2, and type 3 situations you've experienced and engaged at a mediation table, okay? I'd like you to have that conversation among your tables, and I want to share back. And there's a reason why I want you to begin to identify specific contexts of these 3 situations and begin to connect sort of the theoretical idea to the context of reality of where these may show up, okay? Questions on what I want you to do? Okay, we're going to take about 10 minutes or so on that, and then we're going to debrief it. So I have different strategies. I've shared a couple of them with the group for how to get your attention. This is the one I'd like to use. It's called Give Me 5. In the last elementary school I worked in, Give Me 5 was the method for bringing your class to attention. Give Me 5 means you need to be demonstrating 5 attending behaviors, okay? I won't go over that, but the principal was going to go into a teacher's classroom, and second grade classroom, and the teacher goes, why don't you come in to observe as part of the evaluation process? When you come into my classroom, I want you to ask the kids to give you 5, because they are so proud of how good they are at it, okay? So the principal goes, sure, exactly. When I come in, I'll do that. So the teacher goes back to her classroom and said, the principal's going to be in the classroom today. She's observing me as part of my evaluation. And when she does, she's going to ask you to give her 5. But when you do, don't do what you normally do. I want you to all dive under your desks, okay? So, like the best day in second grade we've ever had, okay? So just as when I call you back, when you see me going like this, that's just going to bring us back. I have another methodology which I won't go into unless I absolutely need to use it, but we'll go there. Okay, so I want to get a couple of examples from your experience of what you see coming into these 3 types, and then I'm going to sort of look at the so what. So what is useful about this in our role as mediators or facilitators? So what would be an example of a type 1 situation that shows up in your work? So Jane.
So a type 1 situation, there's a kindergarten student that needs ABA therapy during the day, and so parents wanted a shortened day. School agreed that they should have a shortened day. So, but school said that they would like a mediation agreement in place, kind of to give them more credibility. So we're going to come together, agree on the shortened day, and write up the mediation agreement.
Okay, so they're really just documenting something. They've identified what the child needs. They've identified how they're going to deliver that service, and Really, how do we write it up? Okay, great. Another example of a type 1. Anybody else have one you want to share? Yeah, right here.
This guy here next to me came up with a good idea.
Yeah, yeah, it's working.
You were mediating bank foreclosures, right?
You got this one. This is yours. It is working.
Anyway, I said, I may be wrong, but I said it was a technical problem because it comes down to specific dollars. Either you have the income level to stave off the foreclosure, or you don't.
Okay.
And if you say, oh, by the way, I work on the side, I make extra money I didn't tell you about, again, that's all technical.
Okay.
In terms of being creative or adaptive, that's pretty difficult because you could think of things like, well, we'll give you more time or we'll do this or that, but there isn't much wiggle room there.
Yeah.
So there's not much wiggle room, I think the issue's technical.
Okay. And probably going to fall into a type 1 or type 2. A little more wiggle room in type 2 than there is in type 1. Type 1, there's no wiggle room. Type 2, we got a little wiggle room. Type 3, we got all kinds of creative options, okay? Type 2, what would be an example of a type 2 situation that might show up? Yeah, over here, Moira.
The fun table, which is what we're calling ourselves over here.
Oh, we have created some team identity. I like it.
That's right. We're all about that. We actually had planned a raid on the guacamole and chips. And we took them away.
Let's go create some conflict.
Not if they didn't see us do it. We had two examples of type 2 disputes. One, parenting plans in divorce cases. There is a framework, there are state guidelines, there are rules and regulations about various things, but how you get there can get a little bit more creative from time to time, and there is ultimately an authority in the court to accept it or not. So we use that as an example. We also, for type 2, used collective bargaining for labor agreements, although they could sometimes creep over into type 3. But if you're doing purely distributive collective bargaining, the problems are usually pretty clear, and there may be some learning on solutions to try and create language that works or a process or procedure that works. Ultimately, if the team doesn't resolve it, it can reach impasse, go to an arbitrator who could then exercise the authority to pick one over the other. And it has both technical and legal aspects to it as well as adaptive solutions.
Okay. Make it a type 3. Type 3 situation. Most of what we do. Say more about that, if you wouldn't mind.
I was talking about for instance, a case not long ago where what the district identified as the problems and so on were very different than what the parents identified. So there was no agreement about even what the problem was. And so as we kind of narrowed that down, then there wasn't existing data or information to really support what we needed to do next. So then that was a lot of additional learning that had to take place. And it was all very adaptive work, even though there were some solutions that we could pull from that were kind of off-the-shelf stuff to some extent. When you start out without agreement on what the problem is, you're in territory.
Right. And I have to agree with your opening statement, most of what we do. You're often there because they can't even agree on what the problem is. Okay? And part of our job is to get some clarity on, can we get focused on the same thing and then figure out, okay, the thing we're going to focus on is really complex, and so it's going to require this other level, okay? I mean, to me, one of the more classic type 3 situations is where you've got cultural and linguistic diversity coming in with potential special needs, okay? When we have school districts who are having kids referred, we have a large Somali population in Seattle, and they're coming in, they're relatively new to the country, they're not learning. And so what is it? Is it a cultural issue? Is it a linguistic issue? Is it Is it a special education, disabilities issue? You know, as a school psychologist, those are the ones we'd just be tearing our hair out because they're really hard to ferret out what it is that you're dealing with there, okay? So moving away from the examples, what's the potential value as a model or framework for you as an intervener, whether mediator or facilitator or something like this? Where might you see value in this as a structural way of thinking about what you're doing? Yes, Gurush.
I found this incredibly helpful.
It's okay, you can keep going.
Oh, I'm sorry.
That's
I found it incredibly helpful because it helps you kind of think about what role you play based on what that conversation might be.
Right.
And then you're not, we talked a little bit about keeping in your lane the other day, and I found it really helpful.
I actually can see you applying this model in the work that we've been talking about, your work with FEMA.
I need all the help I can get.
Yeah. So here's fundamentally where I see this as important. If my job is to help them have a conversation, and the question I'm always asking is, what's the conversation they need to be having? This is a great structure for me. I often see people struggling because they're having different conversations. Half the group thinks it's a type 1 problem, the other group thinks it's a type 3 problem. And so we're not even talking on the same page. You know, the general ed teacher comes in and says, I know what the solution is. This kid needs to be in special ed. Thank you very much. That's all you need to know. And we're going, well, it's a little more complicated than that. It's really a type 3 process. We have to determine, is there a disability that requires specially designed instruction, yada, 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 and then we need to go through that. So that becomes a challenge.
I also think that there's another level. So sometimes it has nothing to do with the child. Sometimes it's more convenient for transportation in my home. Or sometimes it's, you know, not wanting to deal with that parent, or we didn't want to have to get a full-time special ed teacher or speech and language. So I think that oftentimes it has nothing to do with the child.
Really? Yeah, exactly. We talked a little bit about that a couple days ago, is that in meeting these cases, we're often talking about that our focus is on the child. Yeah, but often the issues are not the child's issues. They're the adult issues. And that, again, makes it more difficult. Yes? Is it Eduardo? Daryl, pardon me, I'm sorry.
Under type 3,
Yes.
primary responsibility, who is the leader, team and leader? Who's the leader?
The team leader, I mean, this is a leadership model. I would say, in this role, you are. Only because the way he defines leadership. Heifetz defines leadership as the function of a leader is to mobilize people to tackle a tough problem. So in this model, as the facilitator, and I think a role of a facilitator is to facilitate people's engagement of a challenge. So thinking outside the box of what we typically think about leadership, in this model, applied to our context, you're the leader. Does that make sense? In that you're mobilizing this group to come together and engage this learning and this discernment as we're going forward. Okay? Moira.
Our team also had as a type 3 example any sort of major public policy dispute, because there are so many divergent roles, so many different points of view, so many technical aspects of it. And we boiled all of these down to that first column is about the what, the second column is about the how, the third column is about the who.
Okay. Okay. So that's a model. I use this model a lot as a facilitator. And I'm often asking, you ask me to come in and facilitate a conversation, what's the nature of the work you're asking me to do? And are we operating with the same level of expectations as to what the nature of the work is? Because that is going to impact in many ways the role that I play. So now we're going to be back. You will see this slide. This was number 1 of the 3 that you've got there. And if you want those slides, just if you want them, I will get them to you through Jane, so let me know. The second model we're going to look at comes from a book called Difficult Conversations by Stone, Patton, and Heen. Anybody familiar with that? So Difficult Conversations is one of the series of books that comes out of the Harvard Negotiations Project. Okay, so they wrote Getting to Yes, they wrote Getting Past No, they wrote Getting Together, and then they wrote Difficult Conversations, okay? Now, in the book Difficult Conversations, the model that they use for assessing And just as an aside, I often define, people say, what do you do? I said, I help people have difficult conversations. So for me, it's language that I've sort of adopted. I rarely refer to myself as a mediator anymore. I just help people have hard conversations. Now, sometimes I do that from the place of a mediator, sometimes from a facilitator. Okay. But what they would say in their model, what makes a conversation difficult, it's actually 3 conversations occurring simultaneously. So what they would say is if you step into a difficult conversation and you really unpack that conversation and begin disentangling the chaos, you're going to actually find 3 sort of conversational threads that are running through that, okay? And they have names for these conversations. They're what they call the what happened conversation, the feelings conversation, and the identity conversation. So they would say that if you really unpack and explore a conflict, difficult conversation, you will find these 3 conversations. So again, coming from the model that I'm talking about, if my job is to assess what conversation are we having, what conversation might we need to be having, this is again a useful model. Now, the best way for me to teach this model is just to tell 2 examples where this model was particularly helpful for me, one in a mediation and one in an IEP facilitation, okay? And just share how this model informed the situation I was in, okay? So the first situation, not a special ed case. It's a workplace dispute. And we got a call from an HR director saying, I need you to mediate between an employee and a supervisor. This is in a school district. It was not a certified employee, it was a classified employee and their supervisor. And basically, the employee had gone to the HR department and said, you need to assign me a different supervisor. My supervisor is an idiot, he's rude, he's obnoxious, he has no supervisory skill, nobody likes him, I need a new supervisor. And the HR department said, well, we would consider that, but would you be willing to sit down with the mediator, and try to resolve this with your supervisor? And so, long story short, both the supervisor and the employee agreed to do that. And so in our office, we have a case manager who was doing the intake. And when she was doing the intake for the employee goes, whoa, time out here. It sounds like what you're telling me is if I go to mediation, I have to sit in the same room with my supervisor. And I go, yeah, that's kind of how it works. I mean, we don't typically do shuttle. She said, hey, I agreed to go to mediation. I did not agree to sit in the same room with my supervisor. We're going, okay, this is going to be interesting. And I said, okay, I'll agree to start you in caucus. And I was actually doing this case, and so I'll start you in caucus. I said, but you need to know that my goal is to get you in the same room. Because at some point, if we're going to resolve this, you got to talk to each other. She goes, that's fine, but I'm not sitting in the same room with him. So I got to the district office and in the administration building, and they had set aside 2 rooms. And so in one room was the employee and her union rep, and in the other room was the supervisor and his supervisor. Okay? And so I set up the parameters for the meeting, and then we do what? We get their opening statement. So I met with the employee first, and she gives me her opening statement. It's basically what she had told the HR director. She says, he's an idiot. He's my supervisor. He's an idiot. He's rude. He's obnoxious. He has no supervisory skills. Nobody likes him. And she said, let me give you a couple examples. She said, he actually came into my office and he logged onto my computer when I wasn't there. She goes, that's inappropriate. The other thing is that she worked in the maintenance and operations building, and the door to where she worked, her job, this is a sort of suburban rural district. Her job was she ran the district's laundry. The district did not outsource laundry. It was an in-house function, so she ran the laundry department. There was a camera outside the door to her work area, and her complaint was, he's been monitoring who comes in and out of my workspace using that camera. I mean, he's spying on me. So that's her opening statement. So I go over to the other space, meet with the supervisor, and he goes, I don't know what her problem is. I think it's her problem. So he had a really nice story about her. He says, I think, I supervise like 17 other people. I've been a supervisor for 10 years. He said, you can look at my personal record. There has never been a complaint about me. He said, I really think she's little, And so he said, okay, she probably told you about the computer. Yes, in fact, I did do that. But I was there to have a meeting with her. She wasn't there yet. So I was, checking my district's email. He goes, oh, yeah, she probably told you about the camera. He goes, you know, that's just bogus. He said, you can't do that with the system. It doesn't allow me to, quote, spy on her. In fact, I don't have time for that. It's just ridiculous. Now, what do we have is what we often refer to as a what? A she said, he said, okay? And in mediation, when we ask clients to make their opening statement, we're basically asking them to do what? Tell me what has happened that's brought you to mediation. We ask them to tell their what happened piece of what's going on here. And so we've got a he said, she said. And in a difficult conversation, there's often a lot of difficult disagreement about what's happened. And in the what happened conversation, we hear that disagreement, and we hear blame, and we hear judgment, and what happened, who's right, who screwed up, who's got the truth, who doesn't have the truth, okay? And so that in a difficult conversation, the what happened strand is typically the easiest to identify because it's being overtly manifested. They're telling you what happened, they're arguing. And so you can hear where that dissonance is. It's really out there in front of you, okay? So coming back to the story, shuttle back to the space with the employee and her union rep, and you basically say, is there anything you need to add? You know, going for sort of a second round on the opening statements, any additional information, and she basically tells me the same story over again, but this time when she's telling the story, her union rep chimes in and goes, they need to pay for what they've done to her. Now, being the good, insightful mediator, I go, that's an interesting piece of information. And I ask her, what do you mean by that? And as Paul Harvey used to say, what? The rest of the story comes out, okay? So this employee, I find out, she has lived in this community all of her life. She attended this school district all of her school career. She has been in the current job she's in for 28 years. She's been what I refer to as the laundry lady. So she has got a 40-plus year history with this school community. She's a single woman, has no family. And so the school, her job, that's who her community is, that's her connections. She had a habit that during sports seasons, that when she would do some of the team uniforms as part of her laundry job, was to do the uniforms and things like that. During a sports season, she had the habit that she would peruse the local newspaper and local publications, and she'd cut out articles about the games and about the students and about the players, and she'd make a little scrapbook. And at the end of the season, she would hand the scrapbook to her coach and said, this is for my kids. And she'd done it for years. She knew she did it. It was just sort of her way of connecting. Well, this district went through, we have local tax levies to support basic education in our state, which I think you guys have here, but you vote on property tax levies to fund education. This district, their requests for tax dollar support from the district have been voted down 4 years in a row. The community had said, we're not raising taxes to pay for education, you need to live within your own budget. So what happens in those times is what? I mean, districts have to tighten their belts. And so one of the policies that the district implemented, simple policies, we need to at least, eliminate all unauthorized overtime. Well, this person worked a certain amount of overtime because she was the only one doing this job, and occasionally she'd have to come in on a weekend to get things done, get clean from a weekend for something that's going to happen on Monday, like in a game or a meet or something like that. So she was called into the HR director's office, and she was informed about this new policy about no unauthorized overtime, and in so doing, he said, and by the way, if you weren't wasting so much time on those ridiculous scrapbooks, you might not need so much overtime. Yeah. Now what happened? What happened? Name it. What happened? She was shut down. Who said it? Defensive. She was deeply hurt.
Yeah, it was an identity, an attack on her identity.
Well, let's come back to that. It was at one point, yes, but she was deeply hurt. Now, at that point in the mediation, I'm going, oh man, we're having the wrong conversation with the wrong people. Because it was not her supervisor who had said it. It was the HR director who hired me who said it, which is always interesting. And it's a nice guy. He had no idea. I said, based on what you just shared with me, I'm not sure we have the right people in this meeting. She goes, yeah, you're probably right. And so we debriefed and ended the mediation at that point with her giving me permission to go back and report back to the client I had was my HR director what had happened. I'll come back later and tell you what happened, okay? Now, what came out at that moment was this is not about what's happened. This is about emotion. This is about feelings, okay? Her feelings had been deeply hurt. And we have an emotional response when something we value feels lost or threatened. Her sense of identity, her sense of role and value within the community was being called into question, okay? Now, this is important. Our feelings are often the best source of information about what's most important in a difficult conversation. Now, I'm of a generation where I was taught years ago that if you want to have a difficult conversation, what's the first thing you do? You eliminate the emotion, right? Some of you have been through those trainings. And what Stone, Pat, and Heener are saying, maybe not a good idea because that's just a lot of rich information in there, okay? And so, part of our role as mediators and facilitators is what's our ability to be with emotion when it shows up. I've trained mediators for years, and it's kind of cruel, but I love to just throw an emotional bombshell on the table and watch what they do. And for new mediators, it's often like, woohoo, you do it. I don't want to touch that one. This is a quote from the book, but I think it's important. Our failure to acknowledge and discuss feelings derails startling numbers of difficult conversations. Our unwillingness, our inability to go to the emotions is often where we get stuck, okay? And so we have to be aware of. So I have to decide, are we going to move away from the what happened conversation to have a conversation about the emotions that just got dropped on the table? And for us, we had to do that, and I'll come back to that, okay? The other thing that we need to look at, and some of us talked about this earlier, a couple days ago, I think, but what's the emotion you typically associate with conflict? Anger. She was angry. I mean, when I first met her, she was, pardon me, ticked off. But we often say that emotion or anger is a secondary emotion, masking primary emotions. So what are some of the primary emotions underneath anger? Hurt? I'm sorry? Yeah, and for her, that's what it was, deep hurt. What else? Fear. Big one is fear. Disrespect. Confusion. Frustration. So again, I think one of the things I think we bring to facilitations and mediations is curiosity. I'm seeing what's manifesting itself as anger. What's that about? And I would say that when I walked in the room, I said, this is an angry woman. And yet I literally had this just shift in my heart after I heard this. It's like, oh my gosh, okay? So that's that story. I'll come back and tell you what happened on that because it's kind of cool. I'm going to shift gears. And now we're going to come back to special education. Was asked to do a special ed IEP facilitation by a district, and it was the first IEP meeting following an IEE, Independent Educational Evaluation. So the district's paid for an IEE, it's been done, and the district has now scheduled 2 meetings. The first meeting was for the IEP team to assess the data and determine eligibility, okay? Once that was determined, they would schedule a second meeting if the child was eligible to determine program and placement, okay? So I got to the first meeting, the whole IEP team is there. We're like you guys, we require a half a day, so that the director of special ed's gotten substitutes for teachers. Teachers are out of their classrooms, they're there. I get to the meeting, and the special ed director goes, I don't know what to do, but the parent just called and said she can't make it. What should we do? I said, well, that's your decision. You're the special ed administrator. I don't get to call that. Now, technically, the IEP team should not be meeting, but she goes, we're going to meet. I got people here, my staff's here, we got 9 people on the team here, we're going to meet. So the team meets, spends about 2.5 hours meeting, going over all the data. The school psychologist, in this case, facilitates the meeting. At the end of the meeting, there's clear consensus on the team. The child is 1, eligible for special education, 2, he's eligible as learning disabled, okay? Just another thing you need to know about this little boy, he had been on a 504 plan, not for learning issues, but for some medical issues. He had some respiratory issues, and so he needed some accommodations around exertion and PE and things like that. So we're just wrapping up the meeting, and the parent shows up. Mom shows up. She goes, what are you doing? Special ed director goes, well, we were here, we paid for this, we've met, and just to let you know, we've determined your child will be eligible for special ed, and so we'll be convening our next meeting to go over the IEP development. And the parent goes, okay, well, curious, eligible is what? Special ed director goes, eligible is learning disabled. And the parent goes, my child is not learning disabled. My child is health impaired. We're going, whoa. I mean, we've just spent 2.5 hours going over all this data from Children's Hospital in Seattle, and there's like nothing really that, I mean, it was, to me, as an old cycle, like this is a slam dunk. This kid is learning disabled. All the data's there. Parent goes, basically reached impasse. The parent goes, I will accept no eligibility category other than health impaired. That's my bottom line. So the meeting's over. So the school district agrees, okay, we will go back as a district team and we will reevaluate all the data. If we believe that we can find sufficient data to document him as health impaired, we'll go there. Now the district's thinking, it's not going to change our recommendation, so, whatever. So we, ended the meeting. I got a call 3 or 4 days later from the special ed director going, we've met and we've agreed to go with health impaired. I go, great. So I get to the second meeting, and again, everybody's there this time, and this now meeting is for the district to share with the parent what they've decided to do and now develop program and placement. So the special ed director starts, sharing with the parent, this is our decision, we're going to go with health impaired. And partway through her presentation, the school psychologist raises his hand. He goes, and I called on him. He goes, I just feel it's important right now that I remind us as a team that when we were here 10 days ago, we all agreed this child was learning disabled. And I'm going, okay, I'm not sure why you're telling me that because I was here, but okay. You feel the need to acknowledge that? Okay, great. So he dropped his hand, and conversation comes back, and up his hand goes again. He goes, I just can't sit here without reminding us that as a team, we were here 10 days ago, and we all agreed this child was learning disabled. And now I'm going, hello, did you guys not talk to each other? I mean, how did you reach this decision? And then I just had this little thing that triggered in my mind. So I know what this is about. Now again, I'm an ex-school psychologist, so I turned to him, I said, you're a psychologist, right? Or yeah. So I turned to him and said, so what I'm hunching is problematic for you is that for you to agree that this child is health impaired, when you don't believe he is, that he is in fact learning disabled, is really bumping up against your professional integrity. He goes, that's it. Now what do we call that? That's an identity problem. Because what he's basically saying is, what does it say about me and my professional integrity and my professional competence, which is typically about determining eligibility? If I say, it doesn't matter, call him whatever you want to call him, what does that say about me? Okay? So the identity conversation, it's where we're looking inward. And they do often surface or revolve around core values. Okay? And it's really where at some point, this difficult conversation is, I like to use the term, pushing me out of integrity. It's pushing me to act out of alignment with my core values and beliefs. Or I find myself agreeing to something that I don't agree with. And just to be really clear, these conversations show up with staff in special education, in IEP meetings. I don't want to say a lot, but they do show up, okay? Questions on the three conversations, the what happened conversation, the emotions or feelings conversation, or the identity conversation? Okay, the same question. Tom, was there a question?
Yeah, so my experience has been that in what happened situation, in some of these cases, they clearly did not agree on what happened.
Right.
And one of my opening remarks related to when I know that we're coming into a situation where what happened is that I'm not here to resolve the question about what happened. We're not here for that purpose. What we're here for is, okay, we've got to come up with a plan going forward. If you want to resolve the issue of what happened and who's right and who's wrong, there are other forums for doing that, but not this forum. And so for us to spend any time on this today would be a waste of time because we're not going to bring it in.
Exactly. And one of my signals as the mediator is when is it time to move from opening statements to setting an agenda, is when they move from sharing information to arguing about the veracity of each other's information. I shared a story I was doing a divorce mediation once, and it was in my community mediation center, and I shared this story earlier in the week, but the couple had made their opening statements, and then the second move was to begin questioning the other person's truth. And I don't know, it was one of those times, I was tired, I wasn't in a particularly good mood, and I said, I'm just curious, what do you think are the chances are that we're going to agree tonight on what happened? And they actually just started laughing. And I thought, what does that mean? I said, she said, well, we haven't agreed in 20 years. We're not going to agree tonight. And I said, so can we then agree to move on? Okay?
Well, I mean, the reality was in some of these discipline cases, I mean, the employees commit egregious, outrageous behavior. But when they come and testify and deny that they did it, I've persuaded myself over 30 years that they've rationalized their way into believing that what they did was okay, or what they didn't do anything wrong. And so you're never going to dissuade them of that. They're testifying, and so you're sitting there resolving the credibility issue. He doesn't think he's lying, or she doesn't think she's lying. This is the way she's rationalized the conduct that they engaged in, which was so egregious that even themselves can't live with themselves if they had to admit what they really did.
Yeah. And I think it's important for us as mediators. It's not our job to resolve their what happened stories. It's just to use that as a context to kick off a deeper and better conversation. Yes, Daryl.
I'm in conflict. So what happened? I agree with the conversation that the two of you just had, but I think that there is some gray area between the what happened and how that could in fact lead to getting at the underlying issues by way of the feelings that could come out.
So I'm not sure if I'm understanding the question.
I don't know. I just feel like that there is, I don't feel like the what happened should necessarily, for lack of a better term, be stifled.
Okay. Got it.
Because in fact it could, and in many instances should lead to the whole issue of the feelings and the underlying issues.
Right. No, I would not disagree at all. The what happened conversation, I'm not saying, okay, because I've given you these three conversations, somehow the what happened conversations is of lesser importance. No, it's a critical importance because it's giving us a context about what happened, and we're wondering about is what's happened also being impacted by these deeper conversations that are less obvious, that are not always explicit, they're more implicit. And so I'm actually listening to the what happened conversation from sometimes these more implicit conversations and thinking, are you going to have to move to that kind of a conversation? I mean, one of the best examples I have, are we doing on time here? Yeah, we're doing okay. I did a divorce mediation a number of years ago where the parents came in and they were modifying their parenting plan, which means they had a parenting plan. The dissolution had occurred a number of years before, but they're coming in and modifying their parenting plan, which means they need, if you're familiar with the parenting plan, it's like an IEP for parents who get divorced. And so, again, I was doing it as a volunteer in the community center, so they came in and we set the agenda, and we had about this 10-point agenda, and they wanted to address residential schedule, and there were some things around orthodontia they had to discuss, and there were some fees for sports that they need to discuss, and so I had this list, and so I said, where do you want to start? I said, well, let's just start at the top. So we started at the top, and within 5 minutes, they weren't talking about the agenda, they were talking about their divorce. And I'm thinking, I don't know, I'm not here to talk about your divorce, I'm here to deal with that. I mean, I'm kind of tired, and so I wanted to go back to what they've said they need to focus on. So I said, yeah, it sounds like there's some things you want to deal with there, and yet you've agreed to talk about this. So I drew them back, got them on the list. They're back to talking about the divorce. Now, I'm a slow learner, but I'm going to try a third time, okay? So let's see if we can bring you back. And they didn't want to talk about that. They wanted to talk about the divorce. So they ended up talking about the divorce for 2 hours. They had a 2-hour sort of debrief of the dissolution of their marriage. And some of us were talking at lunch. It was an amazing conversation. It's one of those conversations I'm sitting there going, should I be here? I mean, it was literally this sort of really very respectful, in many ways very compassionate processing of this experience. And so at the end of 2 hours, they go, we're done. I go, okay, thank you, that's great. It's like 8 o'clock at night now. And I'm thinking, let's take a short break, let's sort of step away from the table, and then let's come back and get our calendars out, because we're going to need to reschedule, because we've got 10-point agenda here. So they took a break, they came back, said, let's get our calendars out. They go, no, we can deal with this. I'm thinking, oh, please, Lord, that's like 8:15 now. I got to drive home. They go, no, we can deal with this. They negotiated that agenda in 15 minutes. And to me, that was like this huge aha. I could have continued to focus on that agenda for 3 hours, having not let the other conversation go forward, and we wouldn't have got through 3 issues. Not sure if that addresses your problem, but the what happened is incredibly important because it does inform us about what else is going on, okay? Does that help at all? Great. So at your table, yes?
I was just going to ask, in your example where you did the facilitated IEP and the parent chose not to participate, did you continue to facilitate that IEP meeting?
Yeah.
And did you have any qualms that the parent might no longer think that you were being objective?
A little bit. And in this case, I was not doing this from the state. I was doing this as a private hire from the district. So my client was the district. They wanted me to facilitate this meeting. And so it was a little bit different than that goes. And I did have that qualms. I'd driven 3 hours to get to it. I'm going, heck, I'm here. I might as well join you in your meeting. So yeah, did I have those qualms? Absolutely. And I'll come back and tell you what happened at the end of that case, because it was also kind of interesting. Nissan.
Just a little bit a pragmatic tone to this conversation. If you have so let's say the determination was OHI as the parent wanted, or SLD or learning disability as the school psychologist wanted, the services would not be based on the eligibility criteria, but will be based on the child needs. So it really doesn't make any difference which eligibility criteria the team agrees on, as long as they look at that individual student needs and tailor the program accordingly. This might be one of the reasons, and I think Washington and Wisconsin may be very similar along those lines. Our identification of OHI students has gone through the roof over the last 3-4 years. Right now we're almost 22,000 OHI, and our biggest category, speech and language, is 30,000. So you can see how that has, and one of the reasons is OHI is a very soft criteria. It doesn't have that, it has a lot of subjective input that enters here. And perhaps some teams find it easier, and perhaps parents find it less painful to accept such a way.
Well, and I guess I would say, here's my little pushback from the role of a school psychologist, where intellectually I can say services are not going to be impacted. Professionally, I'm going, what does this say about me? I mean, we used to, back in the day, we used to have a dartboard in our office, which was a handicapping condition dartboard. We used to use it as a joke, you know, and the bullseye was multiply handicapped, but back when there was differential funding. But I mean, it was a joke for us, but we believed that we were going through a process that was important. So what I want you to do is I want you to apply this model to mediations you've been in. Where have you been in mediations where you've really can look back and say, yeah, I can see evidence of one or more of these 3 conversations showing up in that mediation. Maybe a special ed mediation, could be workplace, whatever the context. But just, I want you to apply to this model to your cases and say, does it give me some retrospective insight as to what was going on in those cases, okay? So take a couple minutes to do that, and then we're going to move on. How many of you could identify contexts where you've mediated or facilitated that were informed by this model? Anybody willing to share? Okay. Anybody willing to share what insight came out of this for you? Okay. Someone's pointing to you, Bill. I'm not sure where, but like.
I don't know that any insight came out of this.
Okay.
I put out a mediation case that I had, and it involved a child who was in the 5th grade.
Okay.
His parents were divorced and had a shared educational decision-making responsibility. The dad, and ostensibly the mom, but the dad was advocating strenuously for the child to be held in 5th grade. All right. And the district believed that was an inappropriate placement of decision. So, there was a factual dispute as to what happened. There was a significant factual dispute as to whether the kid was making an appropriate level of progress. The district believed he was.
Okay.
The dad believed he was not. As the mediation unfolds, the dad says to me, you know, I was held back in 5th grade. And I was not a successful student prior to that, but I became a successful student. And notwithstanding the educational disabilities I operated on, I own my own company, and I'm doing pretty well. And my son will be well served to follow that same track. I believe that the quote identity was, you know, he was projecting himself on his son or his son on himself.
Yeah.
His feelings were wrapped up in this enormously. You couldn't talk to this guy. He's a big guy, and he was a physically aggressive guy, and he didn't want to hear it. You know, conversation's over. I know what's best for my child. They don't. That was the mediation. Now, it had its own peculiarities. As he's in the opening session, I asked people, tell me why we're here. Tell me what would make this successful for you. What are we here to accomplish? He lays it all out. The district lays it all out. And then the mom says, he's wrong. He's just wrong. He's got it all wrong. And I think the child would be better served going to 6th grade. And the guy explodes. I mean, he explodes. So we end up clearing a room, just he and I sit there for a while. And he says, well, I'm going to lose now. So I said, well, I don't know that it's about you winning or losing. You know, we are here to talk about your child, but that ought not get lost. But I don't think he got past that, to be honest with you. And we were having this conversation. I said, you know, I'd like to think there was some clever thing I said, but I don't think that's true. They had a ton of services for this kid in the middle school, 6th grade, and not so much in the 5th grade. And I said, well, if you're going to pull this, I mean, if you're really going to hold this kid back, wouldn't it make more sense to do it next year? And I told the district, I told them that. They had a moment of groaning. So he ultimately, the mom went home. Mom was afraid of him. She went home. And the kid matriculated in the 6th grade. I mean, that was the outcome. Now you know, we have a rule here where you're supposed to get a written agreement. That didn't happen. You know, I'm not saying nothing. I said, well, all right, that's good enough. So it was my thought as to, I think we agreed that reflected the model you got on.
Well, and the other piece that reflects on somebody said over here, it's like there's the issue of the kid. There's a huge bunch of the adult issues going on in this table also. I mean, it's just so clear. So there was a couple other hands, I thought. Any thoughts, reflections? Okay, it is 3:02. We're going to take a 15-minute break. Move around. I've got 2 more models I want to share with you. One is very familiar with you, to you. One will be maybe potentially new for you, okay? So take a 15-minute break, go move around. Second, we've got 2 more models I want to go through. One we'll go through fairly quickly. The last model we're going to go through, probably it's going to take a little more time. I want to debrief briefly. I told you I would tell you what happened in those both cases because there's sort of an after story in each case. So the first case with the laundry lady, it's one of those cases where one of the frustrations is I handed it back to the HR director and was able to tell him what happened. He's going, oh my gosh. And then I don't know what happens after that. It's one of those things as a mediator, you kind of know about that. It's like, what happened? Did they fix it? So 4 years later, I get a call by that same HR director to be in that same district to do some work. In this case, he was hiring me to do some professional development for his staff. And so I show up at the same administration building. And he's going to have me meeting with a group of people to talk about some professional development offerings. And as I'm sitting in this conference room waiting for people to walk in walks the laundry lady. She goes, do you remember me? I go, yeah, we had this mediation. She goes, I'm the union president now. And I was going, oh, really? And then in walks the HR director. And she points to him and goes, "We worked it out." You know, and I mean, he was a really good guy. He was just totally oblivious to what had happened. So that was kind of cool. Going back to the, yes, Carolyn, your mouth's full. Do you want to talk with the microphone? Okay.
Please repeat what I asked you. What did you say when you had to go back in the room with the supervisor to close that?
Yeah, I'm trying to remember because I actually can't remember what I said. I said I think that there's been a change in the mediation. There's a need to regroup. It's been identified that we may not have the right people in this mediation, and so we'll be letting you know what happens.
Okay.
Okay.
That would be a way where you could kind of let him off the hook.
Right. Right. And I think the HR director connected with him and sort of closed the loop at that point.
Because he really should have been.
Yeah.
No, he should have been on the hook. She was, pardon me, sounds crude, she was pissed off, and he became the target of her anger at the district because and the HR director, she never saw him. He's in the central office. She's out over in the maintenance and operations campus, and so that's, never had that particular engagement. Yes, Sue.
But the supervisor is still having an identity conversation because he says, I've been doing this for so long and I supervise all these people and no one's ever said anything bad about me. So his identity is, I'm competent, aren't I?
Yeah.
And he needs to know that.
That's true.
Good point.
And what's my role in the mediator communicating that? I don't know, to be honest with you. That's a tougher one. Going back to the other scenario, it was interesting because what we found out is that while it was an identity conversation for the school psychologist, we realized it was an emotional conversation for the parent. And what came out is, remember I said this little guy had some respiratory issues where he had some accommodations, he was on a 504 plan. From the parent's perspective, her belief was his respiratory issues were life-threatening. Even to the extent that she said, I often live in fear when he leaves for school in the morning, whether I will see him again. I mean, it was sort of, it was hard. Now, whether that's rational or not, that's not my question. The point is deep emotion there. From the district's perspective, these were health issues that required accommodations. So from the parent's perspective, what she was looking for, I will only believe that you understand the significance of my child's health issues when you call him health impaired. But to the extent that you refuse to call him health impaired, you're denying the importance of those issues. And when the special ed director, she did a beautiful job, when she got that, it opened up the whole conversation between her and mom in this case. And actually they scheduled a meeting afterward where the special ed director was willing to sit down with mom and just really better understand where her fears and concerns were coming from, and really make sure that she was addressing mom's concerns around the child's safety. Now, one of the things that mom was asking for was going to be a full-time one-on-one RN for her child, which is probably not going to happen, but there still was, she needed some affirmation that the district was keeping her kids safe. Okay? Gerald, did you want to?
I was just going to add that for the mom, there was also there was also an accountability issue too.
Say more about that.
At the end of the day, by identifying, other health concerns, I'm holding you accountable for that.
Yeah. Okay. Great. Okay. Melody made a comment at the break that I thought was I want her to share at this point, which was useful around the emotional conversation. I was going to ask her if she would share that, and then we're going to move on.
Sure. So from the mental health side of things, there's a field called interpersonal neurobiology, talking about how brains function in relationship to each other. And one of the things that we know from that more recent research is that the limbic system, which is the seat of emotion, that's where you get fight, flight, freeze, those sorts of things that can activate in this session, that it has an inverse relationship to the prefrontal cortex, where we have our decision making and our thinking capacities as we often think of them. And so when you see the limbic system rise, you see that prefrontal cortex activity fall. And one of the things that has come out of being able to raise activity in the prefrontal cortex is actually naming the emotion, because that naming and labeling is a prefrontal cortex activity. So just labeling it is name it to tame it. And so being able to do that begins a process of bringing this back online more that you need in the mediation.
Just as an aside, as an old school psychologist, one of the strategies that we often use with kids who are in an emotional anger arousal cycle is recognize that if they're going this direction, their ability to reason and think is going that direction. And the last thing we want to do, for multiple reasons, is go to restraint. You know? And so what you want to do is you want to diffuse the emotion. And if you can diffuse the emotion, then you increase the ability of the other system to work on. And so one of the ways you diffuse the emotion is you acknowledge it. I mean, it's the same thing. You acknowledge it. You know, they call it paraverbal skills in this one training. Went through CPI training, Crisis Prevention Institute, which trains teams to intervene in highly volatile populations. And so, you know, the last step in your continuum of interventions is restraint. First part is de-escalation. It's de-escalation training. And so you'll see we've talked a lot about behavior. And someone raised a question earlier about, you know, building capacity within the system. Districts are building a lot of capacity in-house to deal with high impact kids around behavior. You know, my wife every year has to go through training. I mean, she works with preschoolers, but every year she has to go through training, right response training, on how to intervene with kids that are going in that way. So there is, because we're seeing more and more of those kinds of behavioral issues surface, districts are hiring behavior specialists to come in and work specifically with that population. Okay? All right, we're going to move to the third model. Now the third model is one that I'm making an assumption is of everything I've shared with you may be the most recognizable, okay? And the third model is an interest-based approach, okay? So much of mediation, negotiation is built around this idea that it's an interest-based approach to mediation. How many of you would say that a training you've done in mediation was built around the interest-based approach? Yeah, so if you go around the country and you look at basic 36 to 40-hour mediation trainings, whether they're attached to law schools or community centers, are often built around that place, okay? It's a great model, and it's, you know, it's where I was trained years ago. So I just want to review it real briefly, because I'm not saying we should eliminate this somehow from our repertoire. It's a great model. I'm going to share a diagram, though, that actually I picked up at a training up in Canada that I thought was really useful, actually, a way of understanding the particular process. So the diagram starts this way. You've got the red triangle and the blue triangle. And we'll just say that those two triangles represent two individuals, the red person and the blue person. No political influence there. But they're coming together to address an issue. It's an issue about which they both share a stake in the outcome, about which they're committed to making some shared decision around that issue. At the top of each triangle, you'll see P1 and P2. P stands for position. So what this model says is when you and I come together to talk about an issue, to make a shared decision, we typically bring a position, which is our proposed solution, plan, course of action that we think from our perspective is going to address the problem, okay? Now, if I'm the red triangle and you're the blue triangle, and we're coming together to address an issue, like where we're going to go for dinner tonight, and I say, I really want to go to the Thai restaurant. You go, so do I. Well, then we have no conflict, because our positions on the issue are compatible. You know, the definition of conflict is when one or both of the parties perceive some level of incompatible difference or threat between their positions. Okay? I want to do this. No, I hate Thai food. I'm tired. All we ever do is eat Thai food. I want to go to the new Indian restaurant. So then we typically have a conflict, okay? So what do we know about this model? Traditional model says that, okay, if we're going to resolve the issue, one of us needs to change their mind, okay? So we're going to engage in what author calls a telling conversation. We're going to engage in what Scott Peck refers to as conversion behavior, which means this problem will be solved when I can convert you to seeing that I'm right, okay? And so we go back and forth and we argue on that. And the best that we can achieve in this model, potentially, is a compromise. Okay, Thai tonight, but next time we're going, or whatever. Or let's go have dinner separately. You go to your restaurant, I'll go to my restaurant. So what Fisher and Urey introduced years ago in the book Getting to Yes was this sort of paradigm-breaking model that says what? When people take positions on issues, those positions are driven by their interests, right? Okay, so we've got issues, positions, and interests. So what do we do as mediators? As mediators, we typically come in and we have an opening statement and say, let's identify what the issues are. Let's identify what the issues are, and let's set an agenda of the issues that you've agreed you're committed to negotiating. Now, let's start exploring those issues so as to understand their interests. Let's recognize that in your opening statements, your positions seem to be incompatible. You seem to be on 180 from each other, so we're not going to go there. We're just going to recognize that. Let's look at what's going on underneath that. So we begin to inquire as to what the underlying interests are, okay? Just share a quick case. So a number of years ago in a special ed intake in our office, parent advocate calls and said, I want to go to mediation. And my client wants to go to mediation. I said, what's the issue? The issue is that we've asked the district to provide a full-time one-on-one instructional aid for the child, and the district has said no. Ever heard that issue? It shows up all the time, okay? That's like classic. She said, can we mediate that? I said, absolutely, we can mediate that. I said, I'm just curious. I said, if this child had a full-time instructional aide, what would be different in his program? Now, what's that question trying to get to? What her interests are. You're telling me what you want. I want to know why you want it, okay? Now, her first response was actually kind of funny. She said, that's none of your business. He's entitled to a full-time one instructional aide. They have to pay for it, and that's all you need to know. I said, okay, that's fine. I'm not here to argue that. I said, just kind of humor me here. I said, my hunch is that if this child had a full-time instructional aide, you'd be doing something different in this program. She goes, well, yeah. And again, here's where the rest of the story comes out. So the little third grade boy, who was at the time would be eligible as SBD, which is now EBD, but he's one of those significant behavior kids that is well known in the school. And she said, the IEP teams come together, and we've developed a behavior intervention plan for this child that we all agree on. So in fact, there was significant agreement around the child, in this case, and what the plan was. Now, for those of you educators, you may recognize this. For those of you who are not, you may not recognize this. But this was a behavior intervention plan that involved every adult in the school was part of the plan. And it's really a wraparound system of wrapping the whole system around the needs of this per child. So this behavior plan was not just in the kid's classroom. It wasn't just for the kid's teacher. This plan had written into it the teacher, the counselor, the learning specialist, the school psychologist when he was there, the custodian, the playground assistant, the lunchroom assistant, the office manager, the other secretary in the office, the nurse if she was there, the principal. It was a really complex plan, and it's a plan that's really saying we as a community are really going to wrap ourselves around this child to really address his needs. And she goes, the only way we think the district can successfully implement this plan is they need to hire a full-time instructional aide because this is a really complex intervention. They go, great, thank you very much. I said, I think you're arguing the wrong point. She goes, what do you mean? I said, your problem and challenge isn't whether to hire an instructional aide or not. The challenge is, how do you implement successfully this behavior intervention plan? She goes, I hadn't thought about that. I said, well, why don't you go back to the team and, first of all, assess for this child in this building, what is it going to take to implement this plan? I said, just my experience is sometimes if this is in a building where it has done this level of intervention before, implementation, may be pretty straightforward. I said, if not, then figure out what are you going to need to do to implement that. Then assess where you might access resources within the current system to support that, and then determine if you need additional resources. She goes, well, I said, and then call me back if you want to go to mediation. I never heard from her again. Okay? And so, again, this interest-based, what I like about this model, and I've always liked this model, is that we often spend tremendous amount of time generating solutions to problems that we haven't taken time to fully understand. And that one of our jobs as mediators, I think, is to help make sure that they're engaging the right question. In this case, what's the right question is to whether or not we need a full-time instructional aide, or is maybe right isn't the right word, or is maybe your more useful question, how are we going to successfully implement this plan? Okay? Does that make sense? My wife and I have an annual negotiation. We've had it for years. It always occurs January or February, okay? And it always occurs, and the negotiation is always about what are we going to do for summer vacation this year, okay? And so, and if you live in Seattle, which I do, it's like you've been wearing polar fleece and rain gear for months, and Gore-Tex and rain gear, and you're like thinking, we got to think about something outside the gray, okay? So we would have this conversation. Now, we used to have the conversation the conversation used to start like this: what are we going to do for vacation this summer? And one person would respond, well, let's go car camping for 10 days. Yeah, car camping. Good idea. The other person would go, car camping? That is not a vacation. So let's just go to a hotel on a beach someplace and read books all week. The other person goes, are you out of your mind? That's like crazy making, okay? Now those are like two positions. You know, about 5 years ago, we actually restructured our whole negotiations process by slightly tweaking the question. And you might want to write this down because it's actually quite useful. The question moved from what are we going to do for vacation this summer to what do we need in a vacation this summer? What do we need in a vacation this summer?
I guess ours is going to be, what do I need in a Christmas tree this year?
I love the transfer of the application. That's really good, okay? But does that make sense? One question really invites a position. What does the other question invite? Underlying interests. You know, so my wife said, what do you need? I go, actually, I need 3 weeks off. She goes, 3 weeks off? You've never taken 3 weeks off. I've never taken more than a week off in 12 years at that point. And she goes, that's why I need 3 weeks. I asked my wife, so you know, if you want to play along with this conversation, what do you need? She goes, well, if you want to ask me, she said, I need an adventure. I want to do something out of the box. I want to do something like, you know, it's not just typical. So we've now got two interests on the table: a significant block of time, something out of the ordinary. And we went back and forth, and we identified these interests. And once we identified the interests, we realized that we have a whole lot of common interests, right? And we have independent interests. One of my independent interests is I'd really like to go someplace where they got a lot of great microbrews and wineries. And my wife doesn't drink. She goes, yeah, I understand that's your interest, not my interest. But she also, you know, loves me. She's been married for 40 years. She said, I understand that's important to you. But the point of this model is once we've identified the interests, we summarize them, both common and independent, and then what do we ask next? So given that, what are our options? And from that list of options, what do? We come up with a plan, a solution. We choose from those options or solutions, come up with a solution that has what? Specificity to it. In a mediation, that would be a written agreement, okay? Now, why I like this in some ways is I've often used this as a diagram just to diagram the process for people. This is what this conversation is going to look like. You know, I've had people write it on the whiteboard, write it on a piece of paper, put it in the middle of the table, and actually refer to it. This is where we are in the conversation. Why are we not at the options yet? Because we really haven't unpacked things down here yet, okay? So I'm not going to ask you to spend a lot of time debriefing this model because I'm going to operate with an assumption that you understand the model. It's a model you're used to and you're familiar with. Just any common questions or feedback on this particular model? Okay. So now we're going to move to what in some ways has become my favorite model, and I don't know why. If you put this last model into a model that has a name in mediation, it would be referred to as a narrative approach to mediation. And it's built on a philosophical construct called social constructionism. And there are narrative models of therapy. Okay, so it is built around this notion. But if you want to know more about narrative mediation, there's a couple books out by Winslade and Monk, who are out of Australia, who wrote a book a number of years ago which introduces sort of the theoretical underpinnings of narrative mediation. And they wrote a second book that really is a much more sort of practical book on practical and more of an applications kind of context, okay? Now, correct me if I'm wrong on this because I'm not a philosopher, but my understanding, the idea of social constructionism really addresses the notion of language and how we use language to make sense out of experience. That is, we experience the world both individually and collectively, one of the ways we make sense out of that experience, both individually and collectively, is we attach language to that experience. Now, a social constructionist would say that there is no reality other than that which we create, that we socially construct in the context of the language we use to share our experiences. So to put this in layman's terms, we talk about what are the stories that are operating our life. What stories, hence the idea of narratives, have we created to make meaning out of life experience that informs our actions? Okay? And I don't want to make this into a really highfalutin piece because it's, really intellectualize it, because from a practical perspective, this model in a really practical way, I probably use 80% of the time in the work that I'm doing. But the idea says we organize our experiences in narrative form. So when we experience life, how do we make sense out of it? Well, we tell a story. And we process internally what happened. And we use stories to make sense out of our lives and out of our relationships. And the interesting thing is, every one of you has a story about today. You've been here all day long. And if I followed you as a little fly on the wall and followed you to where you're going to go at the end of the day, you would meet somebody, and someone says, "Hey, Sherwood, tell me how was your day?" And Sherwood would do what? He would tell a story about his day. Now, Sherwood's been sitting next to, and I apologize, Christine. So they're like this far apart. And if I follow Christine around, someone's going to ask her, "So Christine, how was your day?" She's going to tell a story. It will be really different than Sherwood's. But we understand that, right? And so this whole idea that our stories are influenced by our social and cultural context. Okay? It's really funny. My wife and I will be having a conversation. We'll go, "Remember when such and such happened?" The other one goes, "That's not what happened." You ever, we have a story in our family of one of the vacations we took with our kids, and it was all four of us were on this vacation, and if you asked the family about this vacation, 3 of the family members would say, "God, that's one of the best vacations we ever took." One of the family members said, "That was like the vacation from hell." Okay? It's me. And because we processed the very experience. It was a vacation on our boat. The boat broke down. I spent my time in the engine compartment. They spent their time sitting on the beach. So we have very different stories. We were on the same vacation, but we have stories about that. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. Now, the interesting thing is we act on our stories, shaping the direction and the plot of the stories. What do you think that means? What does it mean to act on our stories so as to shape the direction and the plot? Yes, Sue?
So if we're choosing to be the victim,
Mm-hmm.
or choosing to be the hero, it shapes the direction of our actions.
Yeah.
If we choose to see the story as us being the victim versus us being the hero, it would shape the direction of the plot and what we do next.
Who we are in the story, and what are the attributes and characteristics of the role that we've assigned to ourselves in the story, okay? Other thoughts? Your stories ever change over time? Now, how do they change? We edit certain things out of the story.
I get younger.
How's that working for you? Oh, was that inappropriate? We embellish parts of the story. We take parts of the story that we kind of like and say, let's add a couple chapters there. I kind of like that part of the story, okay? The point here is that stories are not designed to tell a scientific truth. Stories are not about fact, they're about interpretation of facts, okay? And it's really important, I think, particularly when we're having difficult, challenging conversations, is recognizing what's fact and what's interpretation of fact. And when people get stuck in their stories are not stories, they are facts. For the laundry lady, her story, it was not a story that he was a doofus, pardon me. It was a fact that her supervisor was a doofus, okay, in her mind. So being aware of that. Yeah, do you want to?
I was just going to say, I think I'm good metaphor for this is the telling stories about growing up around the Thanksgiving table. And you have, well, it didn't happen that way. No, it did, whatever, all those embellishments, what you left out, what you put in, what the interpretation was. It's a great game to play. We do it every so often at Thanksgiving.
And we often do it at Thanksgiving, because we talk about previous Thanksgivings or holidays, and I get together with my siblings, and yeah, remember when Dad, or oh no, that's not what happened, or remember when your boyfriend? No, he wasn't my boyfriend, or whatever. Now I'm going to tell you a story. I'm going to tell you a brief story. Just sit back and listen to the story, and when I'm done telling you the story, I'm going to ask you 2 questions about it, which I want you to just sort of reflect on at your table, okay? Story goes like this. You've just arrived at the ABC company for a job interview. This job sounds just like what you've been looking for. Your title would be director, and you'll be working directly for the vice president of sales and marketing, who's requested a private interview with you. You've arrived on time for the interview, and you've been met by the vice president's secretary, who's informed you there's going to be a slight delay. The VP was called unexpectedly into an important meeting. It's going to be there for about 15 minutes more. However, in the meantime, you're welcome to wait in the VP's private office. You enter the office. You know you're going to be alone there for about 15 minutes more, so you look around the room kind of curious about this person you may be working for. You sit in one, well, first of all, the office is carpeted in a short, plush, gray pile. You sit in one of 2 emerald green club chairs to the left of the doorway. Between the 2 chairs is a low glass table on which is a gold glass ashtray. Next to the ashtray are 2 books of matches, one's from a local restaurant, the other's from a local strip club. There's a picture of an old sailing ship in blues and browns on the wall behind the chair, and there's a plant in a brown and green woven basket on the floor next to the other chair. You walk across the room to look out the window. The view is of a small park bordered by some small shops. There's a sofa in front of the window, which is upholstered in emerald green and beige stripes with woven throw pillows at each of the arms. There's a dark wooden table next to the sofa on which there's a black ceramic lamp with a cream white shade. Varied magazines are on the table, a couple copies of Sports Illustrated, 1 copy each of the New Yorker, Omni, Black Enterprise, and Runner. The Verisols at the window behind the sofa are a cream-colored material. As you get up and walk across the room back to the chair, you'll notice that the papers on the desk in front of the chair are your resume, and that a statement of your gender has been marked with a felt-tipped pen. You sit to wait. Now, at your table groups, based on what I've just shared, I want you to come up with a set of hunches. What are you hunching you might know about the VP? And secondly, what are you hunching you might know about the interviewee? Okay? At your table groups, take about 3 or 4 minutes to just come up with a list of where did your mind take you as you were reflecting on that related to the VP and the interviewee. So, what's one hunch you have about the VP? Man. You think raise your hand if you think the VP is male. Okay, based on what? Jill, strip club matches. Jill, what else? You think about that?
Mostly that, the poor decor.
Excuse me? Okay, so 2 things, the strip club matches and the poor decor in the office. Okay. I'm just giving you a bad time because it always comes up. Well, some people say, oh, because there's a lovely decor, so it's a real values issue. What else? We got a male with bad taste. What else?
Well, okay, I'm going to include you guys.
I'm not going out here by myself.
We think that he is a ladies' man.
A ladies' man. He's a player. Okay. Based on
the matchbook. Didn't you say there were a series of Sports Illustrated?
Yes.
Yeah, all that stuff.
Okay.
Oh, I just picked up on one.
Okay.
Possibly African American.
Because?
Black Enterprise.
Black Enterprise. Wasn't it? Yeah, exactly. Okay, so you got Mackenzie, black African American male with poor taste. kind of a player. Okay. Hey, you were gentle. One group said he's a slimy, sexist pig. So I mean, you were actually. Yeah, you did a little more diplomatic. A couple more things over here.
Well, I mean, I was going along those lines, but one could go a very different direction.
Sure you could.
And he's like a 50-year-old. He's probably a male, but I'll go with that for sure. But he has very eclectic tastes. He's a white guy, but really trying to be very cognizant of racial, cultural differences. He's trying to diversify the workforce. The checkmark is checkmark female because he would really like a female to work in this situation because they're very underrepresented at that level.
Okay.
And his buddy got remarried a couple weeks ago, and they went to the bachelor party, and of course they went to a strip club, and that just happened.
Okay. Equally valid interpretation of the facts. Would you like to share another perspective?
I kind of wanted to explain the white man thing.
Okay.
From my perspective, it was the sailboat picture.
Yeah, okay, yeah.
So that to me said white older man.
Yeah.
Screamed that for me.
What's subtle? Like, right here. Okay.
White man.
Okay, one more, and then I want to shift to the interviewee. Okay?
Well, we thought it was interesting that the interviewees.
No, go ahead. You stay with the VP. That's okay.
Yeah, I was going to.
Okay, make a shift for us. The interviewee then. That's who you're talking about.
Okay, so the awareness of the furniture in the room was interesting.
Okay.
For the interviewee. And we thought it was interesting that the person knew what the word versus was. Verisol was, whatever that word is.
Okay, so Verisol. So the person was very aware of the furniture at a fairly detailed level and even aware enough to identify a brand. So Verisol is a brand of shade. Okay?
Oh.
Okay, Verisol is a brand of shade. So it is in Wisconsin also. I'll go online tonight and I will check. Okay. Okay, well, regardless of that. So, what do you make that mean? Do you attach anything to that? That's
Well, we started to wonder if this person might be gay.
okay. Okay. So possibly gay because of the attention to those kinds of issues. Other thoughts. So we've got regarding the interviewee. Other thoughts: age, gender, characteristics. How old do you think the interviewee is? Just out of curiosity.
32.
32. Late 20s.
Early 20s.
Early 20s. How would you describe, what words would you use to describe the behavior of the interviewee? Nosy. Curious. Curious, nosy, what else? Inquisitive. Observant. Nervous.
Paying attention to the wrong thing.
Pay attention. What word? That's like 4.
Misguided.
Misguided. Now here's the point I want to make. Yeah, Carol. Detail. Okay. Now here's the point I want to make. The role of language to make meaning out of experience. Nosy and curious create a very different sense. Okay? Observant, detailed. They all interpret the facts differently. Hence the importance of language used both collectively and individually to share experience. Just real quickly, I worked for a special ed director in a district where he had a very adversarial relationship with the rest of the district. And every metaphor he used, and there's a book on this whole topic of metaphors, was a military metaphor. He was always rallying his troops. That was us. He was always preparing to do battle with the business manager. Okay? I mean, and the reality is it really created and informed our culture at the department in relationship to the rest of the district because of the language he used about us in that context. Yeah.
I thought it was interesting, and I
but what you decided to focus on, what you did, and the order in which you described things, and how you described them, there's something behind that. I don't know what it is, but there's something behind that.
I memorized it.
But if it was anybody else,
Yeah,
tell the
yeah,
story.
exactly. Yeah, exactly. What I saw as priorities are important. Now, the question is, if I was to retell the narrative, how much of what you just shared would be proven as factual? None. None of it, okay? So what did you do? You made meaning, and that's really what we're talking about. You made meaning out of the data, okay? You attached meaning to that. You inferred. You made inferences from the data, okay? So given that model, we're going to share a model that I think is particularly useful. How many of you are familiar with the ladder of inference? What's that?
You gotta give us the end of the story.
No, there's no end of the story. There's a whole kids series of books where you get to make it up as you go along. That's what this is about. Okay. So many of you are familiar with the ladder of inference. Chris Argyros comes out of Harvard. A very useful model to understand. I mean, what the ladder of inference is, it demonstrates and articulates what I call a meaning-making process. What does meaning-making look like? So the ladder starts with the bottom rung, which says we start with observable data and experience, which is what I gave you. In the narrative, I gave you observable data and experience. As we're going through life, we are constantly encountering observable data and experience. And in fact, we have access to way more data at any moment than we can possibly process. So what do? We select certain things to pay attention to. Things catch our attention. You know, things jump out at us, and we pay attention to those. And to those things to which we pay attention, we add meaning. So what are some of the things from the narrative that jumped out at you to which you added subsequent meaning? The matchbooks, the magazines, the sailboat picture, the decor, okay? Once we add meaning, we begin to adopt beliefs and feelings about the situation, okay? Now I'm going to make up a story about two of you in this room who I'm going to pick out at random, and that's G and Melody. And I'm just going to make up a story about them, just for our benefit. I'm sorry if it hurts your feelings, but it's for us, okay? I've been up here teaching all afternoon, and in fact, this has happened a number of times throughout the week, that while I've been teaching up here, that I look over at them, and a number of times I see them talking to each other while I'm talking. And so what's the observable data? Two people talking to each other. And I actually saw them talking to each other, and then they both looked at me and they started laughing. And then they went back and had their own conversation, okay? So what's the data? Two people having a conversation, turning in my direction, laughing, and going back to conversation. Why did I select that data? Because it's really so different from the rest of you who are being very professional and appropriate, okay? And most likely, what would I make that behavior mean? They're talking about, but they're not just talking about me. They're laughing at me. They're mocking me, okay? Yeah, she's doing it right now, see? Okay. And based on the meaning I make, I would adopt some beliefs and feelings about them. They're fairly rude and unprofessional. Now, how long does it take to get from the bottom of that ladder to where we are right now? Yeah, nanoseconds, okay? And the point we're talking about is this idea is that people are constantly making meaning. I shared with the group earlier yesterday when we were talking about questioning strategies. Here's two of my favorite questions. So what are you making that mean? And the follow-up question is what? What else could it mean? Okay? And we see this in meetings. What's the classic meeting behavior that people comment on? Rolling their eyes. What do you make it mean? Well, they're disrespecting me. Well, what else could it mean? They have some sort of an ocular problem. I don't know. Or they have something in their eye, or they're tired, right? You know, I shared when someone drives by me at 100 miles an hour on, in our state, what's called I-5, what I mostly make it mean is that they're a rude and reckless blank, okay? And then I go, well, when did you ever drive 100 miles an hour on I-5? When my wife was in labor, okay? So now what moves, the meaning moves from you're a reckless jerk to, oh, you're in a medical emergency. Does that make sense? Okay. Now here's the interesting thing about this. We will then take actions based on those stories. So I may choose to interact with you. If you were to say, hey, Greg, could we talk to you after work, after the session today? I say, rather not, I need to get some time on my own. Or I might be cooler or an aloof to you, okay? Now here's the important part about this whole idea of stories is once people have a story, that story becomes a context through which they interpret subsequent interactions. And what the narrative model says is that we often go through life looking for evidence to support our existing stories. So I could look over at them right now, and they're talking to each other again. Damn it, see, look at that. I could look over at them again and see them, being very attentive, taking notes. And I might not capture that, but I could turn over and see them talking. They're doing it again. Okay? So our stories become a filter through which we subsequently interact, okay? Is this making sense so far? Now, in conflict, we talk about conflict stories. Conflict stories are a subset of stories. Conflict stories or stuck stories become very simple and very fixed. I am good, you are bad. I am right, you are wrong. I am the victim because you're the villain. That's the classic conflict storyline, okay? Victim, villain, rescuer, kind of a triad. Judgments and accusations get tightly woven into the characters. And this is where fact and interpretation gets confused. Oh, it's that crazy parent. What if that statement is fact, parent, which is interpretation, crazy? Oh, it's an uncaring educator. Fact is education, uncaring is interpretation. But in stuck stories, people's facts and interpretations get very confused, okay, and get wrapped together. Our stories are rehearsed and edited. What's the best way to rehearse and edit a conflict story? Tell it. Exactly. A friend of mine is a mediator, is a lawyer, and he's actually the person that got me into mediation. He said, we often tell people our conflict stories in an effort to recruit third-party warriors to our story, okay? I was doing an intervention in an elementary school. It was the most dysfunctional elementary school I've ever been in my entire life. They'd been through 3 administrators in 7 years. The level of tension was just unbelievable. I spent 2 days interviewing the entire staff just to assess, what their understanding of what the conflict was and their relationship to it. And what I found out that the conflict in this community started 7 years ago with 2 second-grade teachers who over time recruited the entire staff into their conflict story by telling it, okay? To the point where the staff realized we're being held hostage in someone else's story, okay? Now, where else do you see that kind of thing happening? It's hard not to think where you can find it. It happens in special education a lot. Parents talk to parents. Educators talk to educators. And when you start looking at this, stories exist everywhere, okay? And you can go online and get stories. People have stories that are not their own, that they've taken from other people. When my kids were younger and going to school, we'd be typically in August, you go to the elementary school and you go to the front doors of school. They've got all the classroom assignments on it, okay? So you get to figure out who your kid got. And you have some parent going, oh my gosh, my child got so-and-so. I'm going, really, have you met so-and-so? No, but I've heard, okay? Does that make sense? So the storyteller experiences the story account as truth. The the laundry lady's story was the truth. It was not a story. And this gets into a whole other perspective. In many cases, there are truths about the storyteller embedded in the story. Many of our stories are projections and all kinds of other things that are going on. But does this make sense? So another way of thinking about conflict resolution in special education is looking at, I'm stepping into a stuck story. Stepping into a stuck story. Now, as opposed to identifying the issues and positions and interests, if we're going to apply a narrative problem, a narrative approach, the language you often use, remember we talked about this, coming out of Winslade and Monk, is that we actually externalize the problem. You know, the problem's not you and me. It's like there's this problem that you and I share out here. I was working with a teachers union in a school district once where they had a problem. And I think I shared this story with some of you already, but their problem is that we're going to a full contract negotiation this year, full contract opener, and the only thing that we agree on right now is that if we bargain right now, we will be on strike. And so they externalize the problem. We're at a potential strike. We don't want to go there. Okay? And so they began to map the effects of the problem. What was the effects of the problem? What the problem was, they had developed they had broken all trust and respect between the district and the union. There was no trust and no social capital remaining. And I actually said, well, how did that happen? They said, well, we burned it up in the last 2 times we bargained our contracts. I mean, they basically ate it all up, okay? So one of the ways you begin to, so the model that we often talk about in a narrative approach is that we need to deconstruct the conflict story, and we need to reconstruct a resolution story. And I use this all the time. And usually I start the conversation not with identifying the conflict story, but saying, what would the resolution story look like? That's a fun conversation. Now, what does this story look like in relationship to that, and how do we get there? Okay? But one of the things that was interesting about this group is that the first time I met with them, we had dinner. The union sponsored a dinner for the whole team, and I got to tell you, the tension walking into this place for dinner with the 2 bargaining teams was palpable. And I was thinking, oh, this is not going to be a good time. And then people started connecting. And what I learned is that everybody in that room, on both sides of the table, with the exception of the superintendent, who's relatively new, had worked in that district for 25 years or more. Their kids grew up together, played soccer together, went to prom together, and they started telling stories. And a thing that finally came out is, what happened? We used to be a family. Now, this is a district outside of Seattle that used to be a rural district and now is a very highly affluent suburban district because of a certain company that moved in very close by, okay? And so part of what we realized is that all of this past history had been edited out of the story. We started, well, what was it like when you were a family? What were you doing differently there? To make a long story short, they actually deconstructed their story, they reconstructed a shared understanding of what trust and respect would look like, and they went and bargained. And they resolved, and they actually, this didn't happen, but they actually did a full contract bargain, and they ratified their contract in June before school was out. And they said the only way we could do it is that we created a different story to have that context. Okay? Does that make sense? So at the table, I'd like you to just think about, and then I'll share some other examples. What are the applications of this model to special ed mediation potentially? Where do you see the application, for example, of the assumptions that people make? The ladder of inference that shows up as people are making meaning. The stories that show up. How does that show up in special ed mediation? We're going to debrief this, and then we're going to be wrapping up fairly shortly, okay? So, for those of you who have been doing special ed mediations, to what extent can you identify cases where there was this story going on that was sort of, yes? Okay, yeah. And there often is a story, and it is a victim, villain, us, right, good, bad. And then there's stories within a story. I mean, people on those teams have stories about individuals. You know, a parent may have a story about that director. You know, a psych might have a story about that speech and language pathologist. I mean, whoever knows. But the interesting thing about this narrative model is when you become cognizant of it, you kind of realize, oh my gosh, they're like everywhere. Stories are everywhere because we're constantly doing what? Making meaning. Now, I'm not going to go so far as to make this blanket statement. There is no ultimate truth. That's a whole nother conversation we might have later tonight. But the point is, so much of what we're dealing with is not about the truth or not. It's about people's interpretation of what's happened, okay? So here's one of the things that I would put out there. I've been in special ed for 37 years, or worked in this context. I started back in '79. So right after 94-142 was passed. And I remember the first district I worked for, I got to be good friends with the school board president and her husband because their son had Downs and he was in the preschool program I was working with, and I knew them all along. And we reconnected 20 years later just over dinner once, and she said, you know, it's really interesting, but the story of special ed has sure changed in the last 20 years. She said, when 94-142 passed, which was the initial legislation, the story was, oh, finally, we're going to be working together. You know, we're going to be supporting the needs of kids. This is like so cool. She said, 20 years later, it's like, oh, we have to work together. You know, it's that. And on a more serious note, I sometimes believe that one of our jobs as a mediator, and you can agree with me or not, is to, in the moment of that mediation, to change their story. And I think that to give them the possibility of a different story, to have them leaving with some optimism that this could be different, and in fact, it's different because I actually have another data point that's different from my previous data point. And can we begin to build on that? I think that one of our challenges in the field is, I think, and you don't see it as much here, I do some work in California and I see it down there, the system is imploding under the adversarial nature of how things are dealt with. And particularly in Southern California, litigation in special ed is rampant, okay? And so I think one of our jobs is to help people in that moment begin to change that story and give them an opportunity for that. I was teaching a model at a class for a bunch of occupational therapists, and one of them came up to me at the break. She says, okay, I understand the model, but what if you just really like your story? And I said, well, what do you like about your story? She says, what allows me to justify my behavior? And that's often the case. And, you know, slipping into my Dr. Phil mode, how's that working for you? And in reality, she says it's not. It's a really unsatisfactory story. So any final comments or questions just on any of the four models that we've talked about? I've put a lot of information out there. I'm going to repeat a story I shared with the group that was here before. For some of you who are the veteran mediators, you'll appreciate this. I was doing a special ed mediation a number of years ago. We started at 8:30 in the morning. It was 5 o'clock at night. We were even close to settling. And the special ed director stands up at the middle of the mediation. She goes, that's it. You've poured as many words into my brain as I can possibly process. And she just left the room. Okay? And I said a little thank you. And then, but the point is, I feel like I poured a lot of words into your brain tonight or this afternoon. So we're going to wrap up here, let you go a little bit early, if that's okay. So I just want to get, again, invite you to reflect on these models. If you want more resources on these different models, feel free to, I'll email you things on that. I'd be glad to want to be a resource in that. So just a heads up, tomorrow when we come back, our primary focus is going to be on culture. Cultural competence, or as I've been doing research, cultural competence, cultural fluency, cultural humility, whatever term you want to use, but really looking at how we develop an awareness of the impact of culture in mediation. This is not going to be a simple 3 hours, you'll be culturally competent at the end of 3 hours. It's really a conversation to expand our reflection as mediators and facilitators around another factor that shows up at the table around which we need to be curious. And so it's really about how do I develop a capacity for curiosity and awareness of some of those kinds of issues, okay? So we'll see you back here tomorrow, 8 o'clock, continental breakfast, 8:30, starting with that session. If we have a little bit of time, we may talk a little bit about just this group as a whole, okay? So thank you very much. And